Thanks to everybody for coming out today. I know it's a Thursday, you all have your various responsibilities, but it's a good topic, and it's also good to also share this with you, the community. So we've got a wonderful opportunity here, but I'm going to give you a little backdrop to it. This year, we are, the Black Cultural Archives are cataloging the papers of Melba Wilson as part of a Wellcome Trust funded project which seeks to utilize archives to disrupt dominant categorizations and narratives in health research. The collection spans over 40 years of Melba's work in national and regional mental health programs, policy units and services, including grassroots and community activism alongside formal policy work and leadership. As part of this project, we are collaborating with the creative residents Decolonising the Archive, just one part of it, to present the public program which we're having here today. But more so, it's more important about the stories that you're going to bring to the table and how we can show the legacies of Black mental health initiatives in the UK and how those policies will help to secure not only your safety, but your future and your children's future. So we have a big topic here to dive into, because really it's about how do we create agency around policies that have been provided and made for our community. So we've got a wonderful star selection here of persons who are, I would say, activists, but scholars in the field. So first I'm going to start with Melba Wilson. And I'm going to let each person speak about themselves, but Melba has done so much for the community, so I'm very excited about this. So Melba, please.
I'm just going to say a little bit about myself, just to say where I'm coming from. Good evening, everybody. Really good to be here. Can you hear me okay? This is a huge. My name's Melba Wilson. Despite the accent, I've lived here for more than 40 years, and I definitely consider myself a Londoner now after all this time. And I have been working in the field of mental health policy and practice for quite a number of years now, and I'm very pleased to be able to, I have been very pleased to donate the mental health collection to the Black Cultural Archive. Just a little bit of background. I've been here since 1977, trained as a journalist and moved into the Health Trust. And from there moved into a career of public policy. Now that gave me a really good perspective in terms of understanding the health service, but understanding the background and the key players in terms of developing health and policy in this country, and particularly mental health policy and practice in this country. And I was fortunate enough to be able to have a kind of twin track executive and non-executive career in mental health policy and practice. Firstly, I used to work for Mind, and one of my first jobs with Mind was as a temporary part-time policy officer. And one of the things that I'm most proud about from that time with Mind, and then I moved on to becoming Mind's policy director over a number of years. But one of the things I'm most proud of with the work from Mind was that we helped to set up Diverse Minds, which is Mind's Black minority ethnic network in 1992, actually, and it's still going, yes. As well as that, I was able to breach the boardroom door on a number of boards, actually. First, Southwest London, then what is now called Southwest London, and St. George's Mental Health Trust, which is based at Springfield Hospital. And at the same time, I've been involved in the Black women's movement in this country, including the Brixton Black Women's Group. And so all of that together gave me a kind of very privileged position to be able to understand not only health and social welfare policy in this country, but also be able to document it and what's contained in the archives that I've donated is some of that information which I have been able to collect over the years. So that's a quick bit of me.
Thank you very much for that, Melba. I'm now going to go, I'm mixing it up a little bit just to make it really fun and exciting. I'm now going to go over to Dr. Jacquie Dyer.
Okay, so I think one of the things that means that I'm actively in this space, and I am an activist, is my lived experience of mental health challenges. And growing up, for the most part of my life, as a carer of siblings with severe mental illness. So that's for like 35 years and more. And my own mental health challenges that I struggle with and live with. And so that's been a driving force for me to get involved in wanting to improve mental health service provision, because they have essentially not proven very effective to support myself, my family, and my siblings. And so when I say that I'm an activist, that means that I work locally, regionally, and nationally to improve the outcomes and the services for, in particular, racialized communities, in particular, Black communities, and find ways to empower our people to be more involved in shaping what provision needs to respond to our needs, because underlying much of our needs is a racialized experience. So that's me.
Thank you. Great, and now I'm going to take it back to this side to our lovely Kariima Ali. And okay, Kariima, let me talk. I was about to start talking about you. Go ahead, go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Kariima. I'm a second year PhD student at Roundtable. Part of my project, actually my project is exploring the history of Black women's mental health activism. I'm working on collaboration with that with Black Cultural Archive, part of the project that's working on archiving Melba's work. And yeah, I think just as Jacquie said, much of the kind of motivation and impetus for kind of thinking about and thinking through, talking about, and yeah, a lot of mental health also comes from a place of experience, comes from a place of working within different organisations over the years, but also finding that provisions are lacking, support is lacking. And so how do we kind of rectify those things? And I'm interested in ways that archives can do that, how they can kind of reconceptualize the ways that we think about these things, and how we can kind of take the past and kind of make it a specific part of our present. So that's the project.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, we've got the lovely Jonas from Black Fire.
Hello everyone, my name is Jonas. I'm a second final year sixth form student, and my experience and work in this space has developed recently. I started working with the REACH study under King's College London, and through there I became connected with Black Thrive, and the REACH study focuses on youth mental health and how our different experiences and how we see life can sort of underline our experiences with mental health, which sort of links with Black Thrive's work on addressing those inequalities of Black people in specifically in Lambeth and in this area. Me personally, through my own experiences of facing mental health challenges, but also trying to address those conversations that need to be had with my peers, with my family members as well. That's sort of been my main motivation in in trying to be more active in this space and really putting my contributions forward. In my own time, I also work with Theatre Peckham, and both as an actor and as a teacher to young people. And I'm also part of their board of young trustees, involved in like making decisions to sort of benefit the young people in our organization, and sort of realizing how theatre as well can improve and can help young people's mental health, give them a safe space. But yeah, that's mainly my involvement.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do today is, my best is to contextualize this whole forum for you, the audience, so that by the end of the contributions by each of the panelists, you will be able to situate everything that we've said within your own lives, and you will also be able to align your questions, if you have any, in a way that is actually useful and beneficial to you. So the first thing I'm going to start, because as you know, I'm one part of Decolonizing the Archive. So the whole aim is that I'm going to look at decolonizing. So the first thing I'm going to start with is saying, what is archives? Why are archives useful? Because many times we come into situations like these in archive spaces, but we're not actually understanding the power of the archive. So I put that out to the panelists first. What is archives? Why are archives useful? Especially now, in this day and age when erasure seems to be so, imminent. Who would like to dive in first? Don't be shy. Stop it.
So from my personal understanding with archives, they represent a history, they're a way of sort of delving into history in how it's been written about, in how it's been spoken about. And I think it is definitely relevant with you mentioning erasure, because there has been a lot of erasure of Black contributions to society in how it is, how we see it today. And so I think the importance of having archives is to be able to go back and see in different points in history where we as like just the general public may have gaps in our understanding, and understand how Black people have contributed to certain areas, whether it's policy, whether it's around mental health, whether it's just in general aspects like literature. Archives are so important in helping us to have that context and understanding of our contributions throughout time, throughout history.
Brilliant. Who's going to top that?
I don't think I can, but I would just like to add that we lose I totally agree, Jonas, and we lose our history at our peril, I think. And there was a quote from, it's just gone out of my head, Linda Bellows, that was up on the wall here at the BCA for many, many years. And what she said was that we don't tell our history, somebody else is going to tell it for us. And that is so true. And part of the reason why I wanted to donate the papers rather than just sort of throwing them away was that it was important to shine a light, I think, on that mental health activism that has taken over the years. There have been a lot of people who've gone before, and it's so important not to lose sight of all of that work, all of that blood, sweat, and tears, literally, and the contributions that those people have made and continue to make in terms of mental health activism, and how it's also influenced policy and practice. Still a long way to go, and I was at an event earlier today in which Cheney's law, of Cheney Lewis, who's Angie Lewis is the mother of Ola Cheney Lewis, who died as a result of being controlled and restrained at the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital some years ago. There's a law that is now in effect, which it's called the Uses of Mental Health Use of Force Act, which restricts or sets down mandatory ways, techniques, and practice for trusts, mental health trusts, in terms of working with people, restraining people with mental health problems. So I want the archive to demonstrate that we didn't just sort of plop here in this space. There wasn't a vacuum. There were loads of people who came before us, and what I'm hoping that people will get from the papers that have been donated, and I'm a bit reluctant to see it as my collection. It's a mental health collection, is how I see it, and it's important. I just happen to be a repository for some of the work that went on, because I don't throw stuff away. But it's important to understand that their work, we are standing on other people's shoulders, and that is part of the history of this country in terms of mental health policy and practice as well.
It's also kind of how I think archive also play around how we understand the present, you know, especially in terms of when it comes to mental health and especially activism and social movements. It kind of gives an eye into why and how, where we are today. And also to kind of understand that things that we're kind of facing aren't new. Exactly. And there are, you know, blueprints, instead of kind of feeling like we always have to reinvent them and always kind of start from scratch all the time. There are tried and, you know, tested blueprints that we can build upon, and I think that's an important aspect of archives, isn't it?
Anything from you, Jacquie?
I think all being said.
Okay, so I'm glad that you've all said that, because we're gonna situate all of that within Melba's archive, Melba's repository. She's a repository. I'm getting it all confused, but you know what I mean. So the beauty also about archives, when we think about archives, are we aware of the stories and the narratives that have happened within the context of mental health since let's start from the 1970s. How many people in this room are aware of what's gone on? How many? Just put your hands up. You don't have to answer anything, just put your hands up.
So what's gone on in what context?
What's gone on before in regards to mental health, the history of mental health within the Black community? How many of you are aware of those narratives, of those stories? You're aware. Wonderful, wonderful. So this is what I'm talking about. Yeah, why archives are so important, and why Melba's archive is going to be very prominent, especially situated here in Lambeth, because we need to be able to map and put those dots together. Because what's happening too many times as a community is that we're suffering from cultural amnesia. And if we're not able to trace all those stories, the Mark Dunhams and what was the other one you were talking about? There we go.
Yeah.
All of these stories, and then what you find is that underneath all of these stories, some policy has then been developed because of people coming together and saying, we don't want this to happen again, we need this to change. So then you don't have to be spending blood, sweat, and tears reinventing the wheel. So we're going to go in a little bit more in regards to policy and change. And I'm going to situate it within Melba's work, because Melba, a lot of your work stems, I dare say, is it 80s?
Late 80s, 90s. Well, shall I just give a little bit of context?
Please do, please.
First, I am going to tell you about some of the organizations and initiatives which were present. But it's important to set the context for the 1980s. So in 1981 was the Brixton Uprising,
right,
where we were protesting here in Brixton and elsewhere around the country about police stop and search laws. 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected to run the government, and she brought in, amongst other things, the Police and Criminal Evidence Bill, which we lobbied against and campaigned against all those years ago. And one of the things the PACE Act did was institutionalize stop and search practices of young Black men on the street. So that was going on. So policing was an issue in the 1980s. Lack of housing was an issue in the 1980s. Olive Morris, many of you will be aware of, was a strong campaigner around those issues of the need for housing, squatting here in Brixton. Education, young Black children were being taken out of mainstream education and put in educationally subnormal schools, and then they used to be called. employment was an issue. And all of this was overlaid in the context of racism, which continues to affect Black people's lives. In mental health terms, in the 1980s, mid to late 1980s, 3 Black men died in Broadmoor as a result of being in seclusion. One of them was Orville Blackwood, but rather than skate over the other 2. In July 1984, Michael Martin was a young African Caribbean patient in Broadmoor. He died after being placed in a seclusion room in Cromer Ward. In August 1988, Joseph Watts, another young Afro-Caribbean man, died after being placed in a seclusion room, again at Broadmoor. And in August 1988, Orville Blackwood, another African-Caribbean man, was placed in seclusion in the special care unit. And he was also later found collapsed and dead. And an inquest later found that he had been injected with sedatives. Their deaths led to several inquiries and reviews, which contained recommendations for prevention and improvement. The inquiry into Orville Blackwood's death was subtitled Big, Black, and Dangerous. And that's kind of about the time that I became involved in, because Black men were seen and still are seen as big, black, and dangerous, especially in mental health terms. And after his death, Orville Blackwood's mother, Mrs. Clara Buckley, became very involved, and other members of the Blackwood family began their campaign to seek justice. And this led to a high court review into his death in 1991. And in 1992, Mrs. Buckley and other members of the Blackwood family long campaigned to seek justice. Was acknowledged in an early day motion in the House of Commons. The deaths have continued over the years. In 1998, it's been David Bennett. In 2008, Sean Rigg. In 2010, Olashady Lewis. But going back to the 80s, so this is the kind of broader context in terms of Black people engaging in broader society and in the mental health system in particular. So in response to this, and as I say, because as an example of how we are on the shoulders of others, in 1982, here in Lambeth, in Brixton, the African Caribbean Mental Health Association was formed, and its aim is to campaign around issues of race and mental health as a local and national level, and to support individual Black clients. In 1985, the NAFCIAT Intercultural Therapy Center was set up in Finsbury Park, again by a group of mental health professionals who were looking at the effects of non-drugs therapies on clients who had migrated to Brixton and whose ideas of mental health differed from indigenous population. And several initiatives were set up in Bristol in 1987, the Mental Health Shop in Leicester in 1989, and in the 1990s, IPAMO, which is an initiative, was set up here in Lambeth, and I can remember meeting up the road where the Tesco is now, actually, at the top of Brixton. And that was an initiative. We got some money from Lambeth Council. At the time, it was through an initiative called the Inner City Partnership, and I can remember there were big debates, especially in the Brixton Black Women's Group at the time, around whether we should be taking money from the state to fund those kinds of initiatives. In the end, we felt that it was important to try and progress things. But anyway, IPAMO was created as an alternative to hospitals for African Caribbean communities, and it aimed to redefine care and treatment based on a positive reflection of race and culture. Malcolm Phillips was IPAMO's director at the time, and he said the work was grounded in understanding the meaning and context of distress, rather than just providing symptom control. And what IPAMO wants to do was to provide assessment, crisis, respite, 24-hour advice, advocacy, etc. Also in the 90s, the Afia Trust. In 2002, Romero Mukam set up Patty Gift, African Centered Mental Health in Birmingham. service users became involved. So there was a long history of Black people saying, no, the system is not working for us. These are the kind of things that need to be taken into account. And I was fortunate enough to be around at some of this time, and some of what I've just talked about is contained in more detail in the archive.
Excellent. So I'm glad that you set the context there, Melba, because now when we look at how the issues were arising and the environment that people were living in, then we can see now why a lot of these groups had to be formed. And if you notice, a lot of these groups are cultural groups, which then stems to my next question. A lot of them are cultural groups, creating cultural spaces where people are able to express themselves culturally. Because something seems to be happening, and I'd like Melba to, because she would be able to, and also Jacquie, and in this regard, because what I'm trying to investigate here, and I'm asking you, the audience, to help me. We're seeing a lot of these groups, yeah, coming up through history, creating safe spaces for our community around mental health, and all of them have a very strong cultural component, which begs the question, what is happening within the spaces that people are living in when they come here to Britain, one? Two, when they go to seek help, or if they want to seek help, is there or are there those cultural components that they can reach out and touch, yeah, or go to? When a situation does arise, does that very same cultural trajectory interfere with the treatment that they get? You know, because many times we have heard of cases where people are being told that they're mad, but they're not necessarily mad. It's more a case of they're suffering from a response to a particular treatment, you know, but yet they're labeled as, and then given a lot of whatever. How, Melba, what have you discovered within your work in regards to the cultural component and how the responses have been over the years in regards to policy to somehow protect that cultural component that is always there? How?
I'll give the example of, so I don't want to do all the talking.
With your archive, it's going to be a lot of you, isn't it?
No, well, one example is David Bennett. David Bennett's death gave rise to the Delivering Race Equality Program, which was a national program which I led for a number of years. And well, it was a 5-year action plan which received large amounts of funding from the government. And one of the things that it was aiming to do was improve access, experiences, and outcomes for people from Black and minority ethnic communities, and in particular, young Black men. And one of the things that we were able to do is help to shift the emphasis to the fact that it's also Black women who have a difficult time within the mental health system as well. And one of the things that was important to instill within that program was the aspect of culture, different manifestations of how people from Black and minority ethnic communities experience mental ill health, issues of language, issues of how to address those in terms of non-restrictive controlling and practices, which had been to the fore. So yeah, culture was a big part of how we aim to work with local communities and all sorts of initiatives which we set up during that period. And if I'm honest, we made 1 or 2 steps forward and several steps backwards because we're still saying the same things. The DRE program finished in 2010, and we're still saying some of the same things about the need to ensure that culture consent of people, taking account of what people feel about their mental ill health, and incorporating that in a treatment plan, which is based on shared decision making and consent. So, yeah.
I'm glad that you brought that up because this is the part where I'm going to draw on Kariima and Jacquie, because in a lot of those spaces, what we're finding over time in terms of if we're trapping the archive and locating and mapping, not trapping, locating and mapping, we find that women are the ones that, don't get me wrong, men have been doing it as well, but in a lot of the women's spaces, they have been the ones that have been trying to also cultivate and nurture that narrative of culture to more so in a degree in regards to protection. I don't know if Kariima, you're doing a lot of research in regards to women's movements. Could you shed some light into that?
Yes, I think kind of going back to why cultural organizations are kind of where mental health activism is kind of stemming from. What I'm finding, which is what you find when I'm looking at the research, what I'm finding that, of course, much of the service user movements from the 80s and the 70s are usually white and mostly white-led. And the nature of anti-black violence, which is what much of the oppression that comes from, psychiatric institutions and mental health institutions and things like that, and policies that essentially kill us, is that it's a necessity. The resistance then becomes a necessity. And what happens with service user movements that particularly are just about mental health is that then they get to have that voice as being a service user movement because whiteness has that capacity. Whereas black people, wherever we are organizing, the axis of violence is from many different directions. And so you don't get the luxury of having to just organize on one aspect. You have to organize on many different fronts. And so I'm finding a lot of the women's movement from especially the late 70s and the early 80s, we're having to do a lot of that work, whether it was working with kids in schools, whether it was mental health activism, whether it's activism like Brixton uprisings, and many different fronts. And what we're finding, of course, like what we know is that care work is gendered, and care work is racialized. And much of the activism that comes out of mental health is care work, whether it's at home, whether it's in your communities. And so much of the heavy lifting comes from the black women that were speaking up. And, the things that I'm looking at to kind of, as part of the project, and wanting that to be a part of the things that will hopefully come out of it, is there is an extensive politics of care that these women were engaging in. And that comes out of when communities come together as culturally, and there are ways that they were doing things that are very much a way to do things outside of the purview of the state. And how is it? And so questions come up. How is it that we can kind of cultivate a politics of care, looking at the archives, looking at what was done before, and how that can be done outside of essentially always relying on the states and their help, quote unquote, because help is relative if you're black. And so so that's kind of that's kind of what I'm
That's
finding.
brilliant. That's brilliant. And I'm sure some of you might want to jump in on that, because what we're seeing is that creating outside of reliance of the state. Melba mentioned that it's kind of not happened so. It had started and then it stopped. So what we need to possibly have a conversation about is possibly what's interfering with that stopping, because what we're seeing is a situation now where that provision that is outside of the state is not so much there, and we're not necessarily guarding those issues as much as we used to. Am I making sense? We're not guarding the issues in as much like how we used to. Back during the times that Melba was speaking about, there was an active movement and people were creating those spaces outside of being funded or not. So there was a watching. the government had to kind of watch itself, whether or not it was racist or not. It had to kind of watch itself to a certain degree, yeah? But then what's happening now is because we become less engaged with archives, less engaged with following a lot of the policies that have been put in place, less engaged possibly with the steps that have been taken before and the monitoring, we're finding that the abuse is sneaking its way right back in. You know, this is just me throwing out something, please.
Yeah.
I would like to take you to disagree to say something.
So I think that that's quite a fair analysis in a sense. I think that as Black people in this, we're talking from a Black position. I'm talking from a Black position anyway, because I'm a Black woman and my experience is Black. So I'm talking from that. And so in an anti-Black world and in an anti-Black context, the relentless nature of the systemic anti-Black discrimination and oppression has filtered its way through into how we as Black communities actually hold together on things that commonly affect us, and in a sense have taken on the sort of mantra of individualism and there's no such thing as society, and this whole liberal sort of Western ideological agenda which is around divide and rule and separation and non-togetherness. And in that way, I think that it has infiltrated into some of our cultural traditions and our historical traditions. And that's not saying there's one culture, there isn't, because there are many, and I think sometimes we actually have to even unpack what we mean by culture and what we mean by cultures, because I know, for example, I mean, how I describe myself is that I'm a Black woman, I'm from Yorkshire, I was born in Yorkshire, I've got a big heavy Yorkshire accent. I've been down here in London a long time and I haven't lost that accent, that ain't going nowhere. And I'm actually really quite fond of where I came from and where I grew and was raised. But equally, I'm also from Jamaica. I recognize my history as an African enslaved to Jamaica. And there are so many other dimensions to my culture and cultures that make up me. But what I'm really attracted to in terms of from a cultural dimension on some of our issues is about how we can draw back to actually really working together to tackle some of these issues that have really quite effectively fragmented our understanding even of what it takes to overcome and sustain a sense of empowered approach to addressing some of these very, very, very harsh set of circumstances that we're not creating. They're created from an anti-Black agenda, and we are the recipients of that warfare, and it's relentless. And so how it manifests itself then is in the symptomatically in terms of our mental health and well-being. Our mental health and well-being, our physical health and well-being, from every dimension in our lives, right? We're under intense pressure, heavy pressure, from the cradle to the grave. I am quite clear that my mental health challenges are not my own creation. You know, they are a consequence of me trying to struggle through making sense and surviving and living in a world which does not like it, actually furiously hates me. And the whole historical journey for hundreds and hundreds of years has been of that in relation to our people. So the history of struggle in terms of contending with those is what is so important in terms of the archives, because this is not no new struggle, but actually it's not no new set of struggles, but actually we're in a context, I would say at the present, where we almost allowed ourselves to be weakened, and that's a kind of it's across generations as well. So that the divides are across generations, and then they're within generations, and it's like, how did we allow that to happen? And so for me, it's like, I'm not having that. No. Let us. And I speak from us. I'm not speaking just from I. I'm speaking from us. We have got to, I was just reading Nora Zeal Houston. Oh my God, my goodness. The woman was heavy. Heavy, man, she's heavy. And she's heavy from the sense of how much she values our cultures, our way of being. All the different manifestations that we have. We create culture even in the midst of great adversity and challenge. We have our own languages and our own, created even in the fiercest of the battlefield. We are still creating, we are still imagining, we are still, and I look at that, and she refused to sort of assimilate and refused to sort of go down that kind of road. She wanted to, for us to manifest ourselves to the full fruition that we can, and that we are equal on that level. And that's what she always strove for. And I look at that and I say to myself, me, I'm talking any which way I'm talking on any table I sit round about any business to do with our people, because people have to learn that just because we are speaking differently doesn't mean that the content of what we are saying is inferior or invalid. I will not collude with that. You understand? So me, I'm very proud of my range of cultures, my cultural heritage, and there's a lot of strength to pull from the archives that we're sharing in order to draw strength to go forward. And that's what's really so important. I think I've talked about some of my, one or two of my inspirations. I have many, because without them, I would find it really difficult to make sense of such a relentlessly wicked world in terms of as a black body and a black being, right? So, yeah. Sorry.
No, it was great. That was great.
It's very serious. It's a very serious thing that we're talking about just now, and the importance of archives and people knowing our stories as if they are, because they are your own. They are ours.
That's right. That's right.
I think what's also happened is that activism gets institutionalized. And so, it happens today too, like you could apply for a full-time job to be an activist. And so what that does and what that helps the state do is kind of, as you said, divide and conquer. It allows for people to be outside of the community, be the voice for the community, but actually, that's not how that works. And they were finding a lot of that in the 80s, especially. Heart of the Race talks about it a bit in their book. But yeah, the institutionalization of activism itself.
And it's currently being attacked by the crime equality and sentencing bill, which we all need to be aware of.
Yes.
And talk about in terms of how we take some meetings like this forward and be more active.
Yes.
In doing that.
That's right. So we now go into the kind of like a policy kind of dimension on some of these matters, which is what's really contained within a lot of the archives, especially when you think about the significant achievement of the Delivering Race Equality piece of work, because actually it was quite an achievement, whether or not it did in its
It didn't do
construction.
everything it set out to do, but it was an
In
achievement.
its construction,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
But it wasn't able to kind of like deliver to the degree that it wanted to do. But then one also has to remember some of the issues that prevent that we're actually contending with. So I remember when delivering race equality first came out, and I worked as a mental health. Delivering race equality came out as an expectation on CCGs, right? To see how you're going to fulfill.
Commissioning groups.
Oh, sorry, yeah, clinical commission, NHS clinical commissioning groups, and I used to be a mental health, adult mental health commissioner, commissioning mental health services. So, and within that context, you're working with all these people that are actually responsible for the public purse, and then commissioning the range of services that provide health and physical health services. Was there a piece of interest in this? Was there?
Yes.
There was not an interest in it in the whole establishment.
Yeah.
They were not interested. They were looking for the smallest possible denominator to get away with in order to tick a box, right? Rather than really embracing what this was fundamentally about, to change and help to improve the racialized experience of mental health service provision. I couldn't believe some of the conversations that were happening at the time.
And that's the problem when you take the money, because it's a double-edged sword, because the aim is to try and change the system from within. That was one of the premises of the DRE program. And yet, once you take the money, you then become almost
beholden?
Yes, beholden, and also you're having to do the dance. You're having the piper, he who pays the,
The piper, play the tune.
Yeah. If I had to start all over again, I'm not sure I would. Well, I am sure I would not engage with the program in that way again, because I do think it's important to maintain that kind of integrity and connection with the community, because it was the community, and that's the thing that these papers will demonstrate. It's the community that got us to the point where the government said, okay, hands up, we'll do something about trying to improve services to people from African Caribbean communities in particular. But once you get into the system, as Jacquie said, you begin to understand that the mechanics of it actually
doesn't play out that way.
No, and there's a lot of pushback, and there's a lot of pretense, and a lot of lip service. And when you get too close to actually trying to achieve a little bit of change, there can be immense pushback and a lot of passive resistance as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
But we're still here, and Shaney's Law was being celebrated today, which will control the degree to which mental health trusts and professionals can use restraint in mental health settings. So, that's it sets down mandatory training for working in the context of mental health settings. So we do make progress.
Yeah, and I agree, and I agree. And I think for me, one of the lessons, I was so disappointed by that experience that I stepped out of working in the professional arena within the NHS after that, and took some time out to really think actually about how do you progress the empowerment and the drive better outcomes for our communities.
By remaining grounded in the community.
So,
Shaney's Law wouldn't have got passed without Angie Lewis and the Lewis family.
Yeah,
Constantly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. So I had to take time out to really start to understand that I needed a different approach, which was both grounded in communities, but also political. So for me, because there are multiple dimensions here, for me it's about attending to not just the worst outcomes in terms of mental health services. I've lost 2 siblings already to mental health services, and I say to mental health services because they failed them. So my 2 younger siblings, one died at the age of 41, and the other died a couple of years ago at the age of 54, and that's because mental health services did not cater for their needs, you know, and as I said, that's one of the drivers why I do this work. And I've got a sister that I think about every day about, is she going to go next because she's not getting the care and support that she needs. She's not getting it, and I've seen some things that it's just so, it's too distressing for words, to be honest. So for me, it's working on that element in terms of improving not just the services, but our ability as communities
To respond,
to interact with how that resource is deployed, and that we are able to negotiate how that resource is deployed that is supposed to be responding to our needs. And that's what my national leadership is about. So I managed to get that recommendation into the Mental Health Act review, and then I now lead on the delivery of that recommendation nationally, right? And so that's the Patient and Carer Race Equality Framework. There's a steering group nationally. There are pilot sites across the country, of which Southampton and Maudley is one of the pilot sites that's helping to co-create this race equity accountability framework, where who you have centrally helping to shape what that looks like, and who you are accountable to is actually the communities that you're serving. So we're talking about service users, carers, and the communities that are worse, that are impacted. And for example, in South London and Maudley, but in fact across the country, wherever Black people are located, right, you've got this disproportionality. Either you're overrepresented in the most coercive parts of the system, or you're not even in you're getting not anywhere about anything, right? So for me, it's about, no, you need to be accountable on this matter here, and our people need to be involved. So it's the level of activism. I come back again to being active. How close are we as people to being involved in these spaces where you are needed in order to work together, in order to transform the situation? So it's one thing creating that lever, and it's available around all around the country, where the people to come and help do the work with us, in order to sort out the situation. So the PCREP, and I must articulate this hopefully simply, has 3 elements to it, right? One is the statutory, part 1, statutory and regulatory obligations, right? That means the Use of Force Act that Melba talked about, the Mental Health Act, the CQ, we get the CQC in it, them have to inspect based on this, right? The Equality and Human Rights, we have them all up in on it, right? Because you need to be accountable for, you can't be having reports Melba, you know the reports year after year after year after year from the CQC and the Mental Health Commission or whatever. Every annual year they describe the poor situation of, we've got overrepresentation of inpatient and people from Black and minority ethnic communities. You're looking 2000, you're looking 1999, 2000. They copy and paste the same paragraph basically from one year to the next to the year. Never does anybody talk about how are we going to change that trajectory. How are we going to do it? So for me, so that's part 1. And basically, all trusts across the country will have to provide evidence of how they are moving that data, that terrible data, to something different. And how you're doing it is through interactions with your communities, your service users, and your carers. So actually, part 2 is about organizational competencies. So in organizational competencies, you're working in partnership with your communities, your voluntary sector, and your community sector organizations. Are you working in a co-productive way with your communities, your service users, your carers, your communities? Are you using data and information intelligently? There are multiple ways of using data, right? Is your leadership and governance on point to help shift this agenda? And then, so that's part 2. And then part 3 now, you can see me getting really like, I can hear the accent of my own self, and I'm thinking, oh dear, let you know. Part 3 is the patient and carer feedback mechanism, to get to real-time feedback now from people that are using services to help to improve the system, right? So people, so it's no divvy something, right? When that becomes mandatory at the end of the next financial year, right? They're barely going to see it coming. They're barely going to understand because for every part of the country that has mental health provision, you're going to have to put it out on the websites, right? About all what you're doing, part 1, part 2, part 3. Right, so the whole world can see whether or not you're serious about attending to race equity in mental health services. So Nottingham going to look at Maudsley, Maudsley going to look at Birmingham, Northumbria going to look at Newham. Everywhere you're all exposed because actually we as citizens of this here country, right, need to have that level of transparency about what you're doing when we're going into your care. Because as far as we're concerned, when we go into your care, you're killing us. That's what's happening. So that's one dimension anyway, and culturally appropriate advocacy is one component of that. So advocacy, whilst we've always known that is really critical in order to support our people when they're at their most vulnerable, right? We've never got round to making sure that it absolutely is embedded and is happening. So that was another recommendation from the Mental Health Act Review, and that's another thing that in terms of the PCREF framework and you're providing evidence, we will say, so have you got culturally appropriate advocacy? If so, how are you using the feedback, not just from complaints, but from culturally appropriate advocacy to inform and help to drive your improvements around this area? So that's one thing, and so that's around mental health service provision. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that there are the dimensions that create some of our mental health challenges. So when we look at in this tier borough what we're sitting in, we've got black people are 14 times more likely to be homeless than their white counterparts, or in overcrowded circumstances, or in all these kind of oppressive situations, right? You've got a level of unemployment amongst black men which is 50%, and that trend has been ongoing in this year borough for the longest. Nobody knows about it, right? So that'd be that one, right? So you've got housing, you've got employment, you've got all our kids being excluded from school or not getting their needs met in schools because Child Q tells you the experience that they're having, right? So you've got all these set of circumstances, right? The cost is on us. And then we're all fragmented in relation to, I'm sorry, but it's got to. So one of the things that I do in terms of, as a contribution to support my people, is I am a local councillor, right? Because I care about, I don't live as an individual, I live within communities. I live in a family, I live within communities, I live within neighbourhoods, and I want to know that our communities are being catered for. And I've had experience of when they've been properly shafted because nobody is standing up and working together to actually address some of these issues. You know, when you think about the whole process of redevelopment then in an area, and if you're not aware of the policies or the way that things are happening, you're not around some of the decision-making arenas, I'm telling you, you're proper got one foot to the neck proper, right? So it's like that. So for me, there's also the political dimension, right? So I'm deputy leader of Lambeth Council, and I hold a portfolio which is for community safety around violence which impacts on children and young people, and violence around women and girls. I lead around that, and I also lead on employment and skills, because actually if we drive attention to prioritising how we get in our black communities, who are the worst outcomes, it's 50% unemployed for black men, and it's 60% employed for black women, and that is it's getting lower. So that's fast track to more unemployment for our black women. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's jokes. So I'm on employment and skills and community safety, among other things.